Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sometimes I decline coming to the podium because I think they're designed for people who are not as environmentally efficient and compact as I am.
I'm with you on that.
It's really a pleasure to come back from my geography meetings. The annual geography meetings are in San Francisco this week. And many of my colleagues are still up there, but it's a pleasure to be back here, of course, and have the opportunity to comment on the work of Extractive Economy and David Zweig, both of whom were, of course, household names in China studies, and they're not around my house often enough, so I'm glad to come here to the collective house here this weekend. And Clay Doobie, once again, has been magnificent in organizing this. What I'd like to do is make a couple general comments, then take three perspectives from social sciences and geographical outlooks on how to do international work and in China studies, and then make some comments on the papers. Okay, let's see what I can do. Understanding China's environmental conditions is incredibly difficult. And so the work that we have here before us, and indeed the record of work produced by Rick Edmonds, is really extraordinary in this field. And so these very important contributions give us a lot to work with, even as it has to be at this limited time and context, very general perspectives. But what's so difficult in part about understanding China, and this is where the geographical perspective comes in, is that it is a country of regions. We have to talk about China, we talk about the US, the media talks in a world of nation states, a kind of geopolitics, but the reality is that China is a country of, if you want to say the rise of China in the world economy, in fact, in reality, it's an economy and a country of about 6 to 7 different interlocking regions. And if you really want to understand China's economy, for example, you have to understand these different regional economies. And just as Elizabeth raised in her remarks, there really are a lot of differences in what's going on environmentally across China. So that's one perspective. Also, part of what's so incredible about trying to understand China in the contemporary world order and for the US-China perspective is just the degree to which China's industrializing in an era of global environmentalism. You know, if the US were just industrializing in an era of global environmentalism, the country would be facing a number of the same kinds of issues and questions. So you have two countries that try to consider each other as sometimes equivalent, in some ways equivalent powers and players. China's increasingly interested in this, right? A kind of perspective of equivalency on the world scale. And yet at the same time, its developmental trajectory in the current moment makes its conditions and its situation much more extreme. And I suppose some of us who are specialists tend to give China the benefit of the doubt sometimes in that regard because of really the difference in period of the world economy in which we find these situations unfolding. Another couple of things to say is that in regard to both of these papers, what's really interesting is the degree to which they point out an interest in what was even called in the geography meetings this week, the new extractive economies. That is to say, okay, in the U.S. economy, we're predominantly concerned about maybe job loss going overseas or the economic conditions of cities. But, we tend to lose sight a bit of the agricultural sector, the forest sector, et cetera. And part of what's going on now with the rise of China and its need to command primary production resources, that is petroleum, mining resources, forest products, right? That it's actually creating new intensified demands in the natural resources sector around the world. And so that now what you see is that Latin Americanists, for example, are all now starting to do new research on these primary production economies in their own countries because of China's demands within them. So, for example, last month I was in Mexico with a group of people who are helping the Mexican Academy train the first generation of Mexican China specialists because from their national outlook, they've just lost their trade ranking with the US to China. So there are lots of countries and in our hemisphere that are really interested in the China relationship. So part of what I'm trying to suggest, too, as a general perspective, that from the social sciences, we offer strong contributions in how to take into account perspectives on worldview. What worldview are you coming from? What is ethnocentricity? Or when you're coming from your own perspective and not seeing the perspective of that of other people or other countries. And so these are certainly methodological and even, indeed, social theoretical issues at stake in the U.S.-China relationship, and I look forward to that substantially in the context of this Institute's initiative. But if we look a little bit more carefully at the two papers, there's some very interesting things come out that I'd like to try to tie together. Once again, in this context of the idea of China as a country of regions, part of what's happened substantially, of course, in China under reform is decentralization of power from the center to the provinces, and then indeed to specific cities and other territorial entities as administrative powers. And in that context, this is what's interesting, is that some cities have indeed taken considerable efforts to engage in certain types of environmental conservation, and indeed a few have won international awards from the United Nations, et cetera, for environmental best practices. So it's really an uneven landscape of environmental encounter. If you're to travel to China, if you were in Beijing, for example, in the early 1980s, you hardly ever saw blue sky. And it was dusty, and you'd smell the coal in the air, or the sulfur. And, going back in the present, and this is, of course, what China wants to unveil to the world in the Olympics, is an afforested Beijing, the greening of the city. Trees have been planted by the hundreds of thousands around the city, and it's a dramatically transformed landscape. So there's a very uneven encounter with China's environmental problems if you were to go there today, and that's why, of course, the research here is so important. And so in that regard, if we take into account the perspective of worldview, whose worldview are we coming from? It's indeed the case, as Extractive Economies paper shows, and as we know, from China's perspective, China's actually doing more when it comes to global climate change than the U.S., because they've signed on to Kyoto Protocol. And so that should be a challenge for greater dialogue and understanding. Also, if you take a globalization perspective, where in the geographical outlook, globalization is relations between places, relations between Beijing and Washington, relations between China's resource demand and Mexico, this kind of globalization. Well, in that context, this demand for primary production resources, for petroleum, for forest products, for copper, for gold, all these things. Indeed, I did a paper, sorry, as an aside, at the geography meetings on China's demand for gold and diamonds in regard to contemporary consumer economies, where the democratization of diamonds, as in wearing diamonds, is becoming a reality of people buying low-cost diamond jewelry because the consumer economy has risen so quickly. But is it really the global demand for resources about some kind of competitions between US, China, India, and Japan? And indeed, if you take the whole EU together, right, the demands of the EU. So there are different ways that we work forward to look at these kinds of very complicated issues. So then if we're considering David's paper, part of what's so interesting about this then is that it does then take the perspective from within China. What are Chinese university students thinking? And in that regard, I think it's quite extraordinary that he asks the questions that he does in his survey, including, what's the location of the Daqing oil field, which is historically incredibly important in the second half of the 20th century in China. And a good percentage of these students come up with the correct answer. But if we asked, dare I say, American students to find the location of something like that in a map, our results might not be as high. And so there's a way in which his paper, too, shows sort of China knowing more about some of these extraordinary issues, and indeed characterizing them as in the paper as a potential crisis. And so in that regard, I would, there are a couple questions. I have to wrap up here, but it's interesting in his paper that he finds that students from the western regions actually seem to know more. And that's the least developed region of the country. The eastern region is the developed region, high developed region. And so that's a very interesting regionalism once again. And so in this context and others, we can see how a number of issues are at stake in terms of the possibility for conflict, future solutions, etc. I think it is true that a lot of the world in the anticipation of what's going to happen with China is partly looking to China for taking steps towards solutions. But it's fundamentally significant, the environmental problem, because as research associated with these scholars has shown, there's probably, you could probably make the case, right, that if something is going to get in the way of the rise of China in the world economy, it is very possibly its own domestic environmental crisis. Even as the situation for potential future conflict in the world order is also an issue for consideration. And so I'll leave it there, and very much we all look forward to your comments and questions.